Okay, so I want to talk about how we talk about and how we think about the material that's excavated, and in particular the seals, seal impressions and tablets, what I call the miniature arts of the Indus civilization. And so what I'm going to sort of talk about is this building, what we need to do or how we build a typology for Indus seal iconography. So from the very first discoveries of the ancient cities of the Indus civilization, scholars have devoted much time and effort to defining and categorizing the characters of the Indus script. With so much energy focused on the decipherment of the script, however, the iconography of Indus seals has generally been approached in a more ad hoc manner, with scholars and amateurs alike devoting significant time to the analysis of individual images or scenes without considering the visual system of the Indus civilization as a whole. From the very beginning, Sir John Marshall set the tone by linking this image of a seated figure wearing a horned headdress to the much later figure of the Hindu god Shiva. At the same time, he also linked the horned figure with a bull's tail and hindquarters seen in this seal to the Mesopotamian hero Enkidu. In other words, the human, monstrous, and animal figures depicted on the seals of the Indus civilization have from the beginning been understood in relations to figures from other cultures and or other times. They have never had the chance to be themselves. And in this paper, then, I want to spend some time, and in my work generally, I try to really focus on the iconography found on Indus seals, seal impressions, sealings, and tablets as their own thing, without comparing them to other things. And so in this paper, I'd like to propose a typology for categorizing the figural imagery found on the seals on its own terms. The definition of this typology serves as a first step towards better understanding how the people of the Indus civilization used visual language to convey ideas and understand the world around them. I don't have time in this short paper to review the many different ways in which scholars have approached the iconography of the Indus, but I do want to highlight the work done by Oscar Parpola and the team behind the corpus of Indus seals and inscription. The volumes in this series present the most complete collection of Indus sealings, and other inscribed materials, neatly organized and categorized using a series of 9 criteria, starting with current location of the object and ending with the state of preservation. So here we see sort of how the seals are laid out in the corpus. The volumes also classify the corpus by object type, form, and material, categories that are very important for understanding the functions of these objects. But it is the 6th criterion, the iconographic motifs, that is of interest to us here. To date, this is one of the most comprehensive examples of the categorization of Indus iconography. Within the corpus, the iconographic motifs found in what I call the miniature arts of the Indus civilization are divided first into animate and inanimate categories, and then further into distinctive categories that consider the forms and identities of the figures depicted. While these classifications are vital to creating an ordered approach to Indus iconography, they focus primarily on the physical attributes of the figures depicted, not so much on how they functioned. In this paper, I'd like to consider the iconography found on the seals as elements of a visual language used by the Harappan peoples to communicate key concepts or ideas. Visual culture plays an important role in how societies define themselves, and there's no doubt that the iconography embedded in the miniature arts of the Indus cities and towns played a significant role in the visual codification of Harappan culture. Yet, the fact that the Indus script remains undeciphered, paired with the lack of comparable iconography from contemporary or later contexts, poses significant challenges to the interpretation of these materials. With these limitations in mind, I approach the seals, ceilings, and tablets of the Indus Valley or of the Indus civilization as elements in a visual system that use specific imagery to convey meaning or information to an informed viewer. For example, much as we have learned to understand the image of two ovals and a curved line in a yellow circle as representative of a smiling human face, informed viewers in the Harappan world would have seen the unicorn, like the one depicted on the right side of the slide, and immediately understood its embedded meaning. While we may not know the meaning embedded in the imagery of the Harappan world, there is still much we can learn by carefully examining the ways in which these images were created and used. In this section, I'd like to consider the motifs of the Indus figure lexicon as part of a larger communication system in which standardized images play the role of mnemonic devices. These devices may embody an important cultural concept, or they may serve to remind the viewer of a story with which they are already familiar. In order to understand this visual system, we first need to break it down into its component parts in order to understand then how they work together to create or not create meaning. Before coming to the concept of visual language, however, I want to take a second to point out why seals are so important when we're discussing the propagation of imagery. Unlike sculptures, figurines, pottery, or even beads, seals are a reproductive technology. They can produce endless copies of themselves, and these copies and impressions, which like the seals themselves are small, have the ability to carry the iconography and imagery of the seal over long distances. So, to understand the iconography, it's helpful to break the images down, as I mentioned, into their component parts. In this discussion, I use the term character to refer to the individual figures that exist within the visual lexicon of the Harappan world. Each character is defined by a series of physical attributes or behaviors that define its identity and make it easily recognizable to someone familiar with Harappan iconography. Characters can appear either as single iconic figures or as part of a more complex scene that includes a number of different individuals or elements. And so to start, the easiest characters to identify and classify are the real animals, much as Parpala does in his volumes, the ones that were circulating and familiar to people living in South Asia in the 3rd millennium BC. These animals make up the large majority of the corpus, and with few examples are rarely found in combination with other characters or in scenes that suggest interaction. So more interesting then, and possibly more helpful in understanding the iconographic system, are a second group of characters who seem to belong to the mythological realm. And these characters are distinct figures whose attributes, whether physical or behavioral, suggest that they belong to a realm outside the norms of everyday life. They can include not only monsters and demons, but also human or animal figures placed in unusual, possibly ritual situations, or in situations where they are interacting with those monsters and or demons. And so some of these figures, and I've sort of classified them in a going from sort of the simplest to the most complex. These can include horned animals, in particular animals who are not horned in nature, but then are depicted with horns, such as this horned elephant or this horned tiger. They also include composite animals, animals made up of the parts of a number of different animals, often depicted as having multiple heads on a single body. In many ways, these creatures embody the very definition of a monster or a mythological creature. In addition, we have figures that seem fully human but are in unusual positions, like this figure in a tree which seems to be interacting with a tiger with its head turned back towards it, or this large figure shown battling or mastering two large tigers. There are a number of anthropomorphic figures that have special attributes, in particular horns. And there are a couple of these. The first that I mentioned are these horned humans, which have a single horn or plume coming out of their heads, which I've referred to in the past as devotees, because we often see them in multiples in a line or in multiples in battle with a bull or buffalo. There are also horned human figures with larger horns, with the horns of two animals. And I'll talk about these briefly in a second, but these make up another class of mythological characters. And here we can see another one, the seated figure with horns. Then there are the human-animal composite creatures, some of which exist on 2 feet, like this, what I like to call the horned furry anthropomorph, which is found primarily on the copper tablets from Mohenjo-daro, or this figure which is half bull and half human, shown in battle with a tiger on the seal from Mohenjo-daro. And this is the figure that Marshall had originally associated with the Mesopotamian demigod Enkidu. Then there's a whole series of human-animal composites, which I call centaurs, that are 4-legged. And there's 3 distinct types of these, which you can see here. The one that Fernetz and Vidale have referred to as the chimera, this one which seems to be more like a large human-headed markhor goat, and the third one, which I refer to as the tiger centaur. On close observation, it appears that the natural and unnatural creatures that inhabit the Harappan pantheon function primarily as image signs, figures or symbols that, according to Andre Grabar, appeal above all to the intellect and imply more than they actually show. They appear on their own in static poses and rarely participate in actions of any kind. Naturally, this is particularly true of the figures seen on seals, which offer limited physical space for narrative exposition. Yet a few of the seals and a larger number of the molded tablets have representations that involve multiple characters or represent characters in specific acts that may be identified as either iconic or narrative. And it's these scenes that I want to discuss more in the following section. But before I get to those, I want to talk quickly about this concept of a character. One of the things that we find ourselves facing sort of as we first talk about these images is how distinctive is each character and how much specificity is necessary to identify a character as an individual. And I take as an example these 2 images of tigers. These are from a molded tablet from Mohenjo-daro. And we have 2 tigers represented here. One which is smaller and facing forward, and you can see its long tail here. And then a second tiger which is facing backwards. And if you're familiar with Indus iconography, you'll recognize this tiger as the tiger that we generally see with the human figure in the tree. And so our first question is, do both these figures, both these images represent the same tiger, or are they actually meant to represent distinctive separate tigers? This is a fairly simple one, right? When we get to the horned human figures, we can see that they differ from each other in so many ways that we're left to wonder, again, whether the single seated human figure represents only one figure only one character, or whether there are many different characters being represented by these figures. So how specific do they need to be for us to understand them as a separate element within this visual language? In a way, this is the same question that arises with variants in the Indus script, right? How much does a variant need to be different in order to be understood as a completely different character? And how much is it just, okay, this is just, somebody with slightly different handwriting? And so this is one of the questions that comes up with when talking about the characters. As I mentioned, however, the characters can also live within a realm of activity. So now that we have assembled a cast of characters, it is then possible to try to observe the ways in which they work together. For the purposes of this presentation, I use the term scene to refer to an image that includes a number of different characters or elements interacting with each other. The scenes with multiple elements or characters generally show a single moment in time and may provide us with the simplest form of narrative representation. Unlike the image signs I discussed before, the scenes provide more context for the viewer to understand the event that's being referenced or the role of the character in that event. Again, this is not iconography that we know, so we can't read it as specific stories, but they're not just pure representation of a figure. They actually refer to an underlying, or most likely underlying story. The intentional pairing of specific characters and or attributes is a clear indication that these specific combinations of imagery held meaning for the peoples of the Indus. And so here also, it may be profitable to divide the scenes that make up Indus narrative into three major themes: human-animal interaction, human-human interaction, and what I call devotional scenes. And so here also we see some examples of this human-animal interaction. Some of them seem to be images of sort of communication with animals. We see both in the seal impression from Banawali and on the seal from Kalibangan, the human figure with its hand raised, seemingly communicating with the animal. And we see it here in multiple examples of this tiger and the human in a tree figure or scene. Also, the Master of Animals scene shows this interaction between humans and animals. And then there's a series of scenes that seem to show combat between humans and bulls and humans and buffalo. And this takes a number of different forms, from the top impression that the top molded tablet that you see above there, where the human seems to be approaching the bull directly, to the lower scene where we have a figure with a spear attacking a bull, and this one where we see a bull instead attacking a series of humans, a bull or a buffalo attacking a series of humans who seem to be some of these devotee figures. There are a number of scenes that are ritual, like these adoration scenes, such as the sludge scene from Mohenjo-daro, the sludge seal from Mohenjo-daro, or scenes of tree worship, like the ones that we see here, both on the top and the bottom of this tablet from Mohenjo-daro. And then we have on this seal from Kalibangan, this image of human to human contact or combat. So these individual and iconic scenes raise the question of narrative, right? Are these meant to tell stories? If they're meant to tell stories, what are the stories that they're trying to tell? Do individual scenes function to tell a story? does placing scenes together, juxtaposing scenes one next to the other, is that intended to tell a story, or is this just a pairing of different icons? So for example, on this tablet from Mohantra, right, we see on one hand this figure of the tiger and the human in the tree paired with a human figure with bangles on its arms and sort of holding two human figures who seem to be uprooting trees. And then above here, a human figure leaning towards seemingly making an offering towards a large plant or a tree. So the question here is, are these three scenes meant to work together? Does each of these three scenes have its own meaning? And so what you're getting here is, three short phrases that tell you something, three short phrases that may or may not be related. Or are these three short phrases related to each other and meant to tell a larger story? And in most cases, this is very difficult to understand, and it's much easier to kind of approach these scenes as their own sort of larger image signs, so which tell a slightly larger story than the characters by themselves. Where we can start trying to identify a larger story is in places and in scenes where we see the same characters and the same visual elements repeated. So we have these three seals, right? This is a very common one of the figure in the tree communicating with the tiger. But then we have a second seal from Chanhudo, which shows, again, the tree, the figure, and the tiger, but the positions have changed. And here the figure seems to be really down on the ground with the tiger. The tiger almost seems to have its tongue out to be licking this figure. And so there's an interaction. And Greg Purcell was the first one to suggest that there was a connection between these two scenes and that they represent different parts of the story. I add to this figure of the horned figure battling the tiger. There's some variation here, but the three elements, the human, tiger, and tree, are still the same. So it gives an impression that we're still in the same space. By that same token, but a little bit harder to think through, are these scenes of where we see that devotee figure appearing again and again, and starting with this divine adoration scene from Mohantra, where we have this row of devotees to the combat scene we have this from Banawali, we have it from Mohantra, where a bull or buffalo seems to be really attacking these devotees, these single-horned humans, to then the seal, again, a lost seal from Chanhudo, where we see the bull attacking a devotee more personally. And so here we start to question whether there is such a thing as a multi-scene narrative, times when a story is shown over the course of multiple either seals or sealings. And so the reason why I try to organize my understanding of Indus iconography in this way, and to sort of build this classification and typology, is in order to think more deeply about how this imagery functioned, how it functioned as part of a visual language that was familiar to people of the Indus, that they would have seen and recognized and been able to read in ways that we cannot. But if we start sort of classifying it, maybe in ways similar to how we classify the script, we can start to have a better understanding of how this image system then worked and what it may have meant to the people of the Indus. Thank you.